Hi, this is Rex Carden with the University of Alabama at Birmingham, and today I'm going to talk about two big challenges that you will face when you're developing Eclipse scripting apps. The first one is that it's very challenging to do multi-threaded operations which do not lock the user interface. It's just a very difficult problem because the Eclipse scripting API is a COM-based library, and so it relies on accessing only through a single thread. It's very difficult, and the more time you spend with it, the more difficult you realize it is. The other problem is it's difficult to debug plugins. Those are scripts that are going to run directly in the Eclipse application. So today I hope I can show you a new library, which I call ESAPIX, that helps provide a mechanism for dealing with both of those challenges, and it should make it pretty easy for you to get your apps off the ground and test plugin scripts, all with multi-threading support. So let's take a look at how it works. Normally when you're building an app, you'll either access it through an application class for a standalone application, or you might be using the script context class that's provided when you build a plugin. And Eclipse will inject an instance of this into your script. That's good, those both work, but they're challenging because they require two different sets of applications as you're building, because they have such different interfaces themselves. What I've done in the Eclipse Scripting API X library is I've built a common interface which I call iScriptContext, and basically it abstracts these two classes behind the scenes and makes them accessible through a single interface which can be used in your view models. This is good for two things. It provides the common interface, and it also provides multi-threading support by default. So I'll show you how that works in just a second. We're going to build a little demo app. But the main idea is that your application is only going to see this iScriptContext interface and won't interact with the application class or the script context class directly. So right now we're going to pretend we're going to build a plugin script. To get started, we're going to create a new project. We're going to make a WPF application, and we're going to call this ESAPIX demo. Press OK. We can go ahead and get rid of this main window. We're not going to need that. And as always, we want to make some references. We're going to add the references to the VMS namespace. We're also going to be referencing 64-bit architecture, so we want to make sure that our any CPU is changed to only build to x64. If you don't do that, you're going to get a reference assembly error. Let's go ahead and bring in the ESAPIX framework. To do that, you go to References, right-click, say Manage NuGet Packages, and you can go to Browse. And if you type in ESAPI, you should see a couple of libraries. One is for version 11, and one is if you're on 13. So I'm on 13.6. So I'm going to click on this and press Install. This is actually going to pull in several libraries. ESAPIX depends on several libraries for MVVM functionality and dependency injection. Once you're all wired up here, we need to create a script class. That's what Eclipse is going to be looking for. So let's go ahead and make that now. Let's go script. And when you make a script class, it actually needs to be in the namespace vms.tps. It needs to be public. And I've got a little helper here that's going to help build this class for you. If you use ESAPIX in the AppKit space, there is a class called xscript multithread base. And that's going to basically make this script for you. And you just have to implement a simple method called xexecute. And I want to introduce you to what it's doing here. So there's a plugin context. Plugin context is the same as the script context, but it's been wrapped in the iScriptContext interface. Remember, I told you there's a common interface that ESAPIX uses to to make your applications. And then I'm also using a dispatcher frame that I'm taking from the window. I took this technique from Carlos Anderson at the University of Michigan. This helps figure out when to dispose the script context at the right time. So just make sure that we have it the entire time that we need it. All right, so what do we do inside this execute method? Well, we need to make a bootstrapper. It's called a script bootstrapper. Let's see, new script bootstrapper. Now the script bootstrapper actually it's going to need a window, and we haven't built one yet, so let's go ahead and do that before we make this bootstrapper. When you're doing MVVM architecture, you normally will have two different folders, and you're going to need them for this. So make a new folder in a project. One's called Views, and make another folder called View Models. This is actually really important. ESAPIX relies on dependency injection and MVVM view model location, and your folders will have to be named exactly this for it to work. Let's go ahead and make our view. So let's do add window, and we'll just call this main. And then let's make a view model, just a simple class, and we'll call it main view model. This part's important also. Whatever your view is called, in this case it's called main, we need to make a view model that has the name of the view and then the word view model directly after it, exactly like this. That's going to help us auto-wire our view models to our views so we don't have to do it with our own code. That was all built into the Prism library, which ESAPIX depends on. Alright, so we have our script bootstrapper, and now we can finally tell it that we want to launch the main window as the first view. That's what this thing takes. It's asking what window do I build? And then we just need to pass in our plugin context and our dispatcher frame. Once we do that, we just say run. There's a method on the bootstrapper called run, and that's going to launch a new window in a new thread that is separate from the Eclipse thread. So that's going to provide some multi-threading access. Let's go ahead and start with our view model. Let's make it something interesting here. So first of all, view model needs to be public. And it also needs to inherit from something called bindable base. This is provided in the Prism library. And it adds some methods so that when properties are updated, you can update the user interface. Basically, it implements iNotify property change. Let's make a constructor, main view model. And when you're building your constructors and you're using ESAPIX, you want to pass in something called iScript context. That's the wrapper for the script context. And you're not going to have to pass it in yourself. This is automatically going to happen. And whenever you bring it in, what I like to do is make a local copy of it. Make sure I have a reference to that, which I'll put right here. All right, what are we going to do in our main view model? Well, let's show you three different things. The first thing is, let's create a property for both the UI thread and the Eclipse thread, so we can see that they're two different threads. And then let's also get a string property for the plan, the currently loaded plan, and we'll show that on the user interface. So the way I'm going to build these properties, let me zoom in, make sure you can see here, is I'm going to type in prop full tab, and that's a quick way to build a backing field and a property. And the first one I'm going to call UI thread, and the property will just be a capital letter, the same thing. Now, the bindable base provides a special method that we're going to need to use when you're building properties. This will set the backing thread, that's fine, but when you're wanting to update the user interface, you need to use a special technique, and in the bindable base it's called set property. This is the way you use it. You do a reference to the backing field, and then you pass the value. Basically what that does is it will set the backing field and also notify the user interface that something has changed, and that way it will show up on the user interface. I'm going to build two more properties just like this. Okay, so you can see I have a VMS thread property now, and also a current plan. Oh, this should not be an int, it should be a string. We have a current plan property. Let's go ahead and set what those values are supposed to be. So when the main view model is constructed, that's going to be using the UI thread. So we can simply do the UI thread equals thread current thread managed thread ID. The VMS thread is going to come from the iScript context. So the iScript context actually has a reference to the thread as a property called thread, and that has a thread ID on it as well. So we've set our two properties. What we're going to do is on our user interface, we're going to see that these two numbers are different, which means it's a multi-threaded application. The last thing we want to do is we want to set our current plan, the string for that. And that's going to show up on the user interface. Now here is the trick. Because it's multi-threaded, you don't want to access properties in the script context directly. Instead, you want to use the thread that comes with the iScript context interface, and you want to invoke whatever you want to do on that thread. So in this case, we want to set our current plan equal to the plan setup ID. Now, the only tricky part here is we also want to run this in standalone mode. And when we first launch the standalone mode, the plan setup is not going to be set to anything. You have to do that manually. So we need to make sure that we're checking to see if this is null. One cool way you can do that in C#6 is to just put a question mark behind the property, and that does the equivalent of if CTX plan setup is not null, then do this operation. And if it is null, then just pass in null. Okay, so I think that's all we need to do. And this is ready to go as a simple Eclipse script. Now to prepare it to run in standalone mode, we need to actually go into the app.xaml and turn off this startup URI. And then we need to go in the app.xaml CS and override the startup method. We'll still call the base startup, but then we're going to make another Bootstrapper. This one's called app Bootstrapper. It's also going to take the window to start. And in this case, you can actually pass in your VMS username and password. I'm just going to do null and null. Let's make sure we include our views here. And just like the script Bootstrapper, you need to call the run method. Okay, this is going to do the same thing. It's going to launch our main window and then plug in our main view model. Let's go make sure our view has something in it. Right now it's pretty plain. Before we do anything to it, we need to add a reference to the Prism library. The way you do that is you do XMLNS namespace here, and we can call it Prism, and then you should see something called prismlibrary.com. Make sure you have that in there. And then once you have that namespace available, you want to get this view model locator, auto wire to true. And basically what that means is whenever this window is called, it's going to look in the view models folder and see if it can find a matching view model that goes with this window. Let's put a stack panel in here. And I'm going to go ahead and pause it for a second. I'm going to make some properties that are going to fill this window. Okay, it's pretty boring, but it will show you exactly what we're doing. I put a UI thread, label and then the value, VMS thread, label and value, and then the current plan. These are the three properties that we had in our view model. Okay, so we should see those whenever we launch our application. Since we're ready to launch in standalone mode now that we've hijacked the app.xaml, let's go ahead and run this project. We should see the credentialing system pull up here, and it does. This wouldn't come up if you had put in your username and password. It says my disk space is low. There's a splash that comes with the ESAPIX framework. And here's what you get. You get your application, and then you get this thing on top that ESAPIX is going to plug in when you're in standalone mode. It's going to let you pick your patient and then pick your course and your plan. Okay, so let's just get a patient here pulled up. PhysX C3 DLG 15X, I think, is a patient. So when you press update context, you can see this is actually all happening asynchronously. It updates the status, and you can see that we have our plans here. Now, we don't have anything populating here. Why is that? Well, remember, we only populated this field in the very beginning in the constructor. We need to do something to make sure that we are aware whenever the application context is changing either patients or plans. So let's go ahead and do that part now. Let's make a method in the constructor, and let's call it subscribe to app change, and then pass in the context. And we only want this method to actually do anything if the context is what's called a standalone context, not the script context, but a standalone. So we need to ask that question right here. If CTX is standalone context, which means we're running it in standalone mode, then let's make that into a standalone context as standalone context. And the standalone context has some cool little events. One of them is called plan setup changed. So let's go ahead and grab that, and let's attach a new method to that event. You can see that that event passes in the plan setup that's recently changed. Now, you do not want to touch this plan setup directly. Remember, it's multi-threaded by default. So we need to grab our field CTX and grab the thread from it. And in this case, let's go ahead and do this asynchronously. Let's do invoke async. That way, make sure there's no locking of the user interface. And we can either make this method asynchronous and even put an await keyword on here. And inside of here, what we want to do is we just want to make sure that our current plan is equal to ps.id. So the plan that has just recently changed, this is now the focus plan. We just want to set our current plan ID whenever the application context is changing. So I'm going to go ahead and save it. Let's run it again. All right, let's put in our ID that we know, DLG15X. And now we can see that the current plan label was changed. And let's see what happens when we change plans. We can see that this is continuing to update. So the standalone context actually has a couple different methods. It has events: patient changed, course changed, and plan changed. So you can hook into all of those and test your user interface and your application in different scenarios. And you could continue to change patients here if you were still wanting to know if something was going to work somewhere else, a different scenario. You can continue to do this. If you can't find the patient, it'll say patient not found. So you'll know immediately if something is not right. Okay. You can also hide this little bar here to see what your user interface looks like without being hijacked by ESAPIX. The last thing we need to do is we need to make sure this is going to run as a script. And it will. We've already done everything we need to. We just need to make two small changes. The first thing is we need to right-click our project, go to Properties, and make sure that the assembly name has the .esapi suffix here, because Eclipse is looking for that on the assembly name. So let's go ahead and rebuild once we've changed that. Then the other part is let's go into the folder, our bin folder, and we can go into x64, it's where it's located. Let's find our executable, and we need to just change this from an executable into a DLL. And once you've done that, you are ready to run it as a plugin. So from Eclipse, you can see if we have something moded up, we can go to Tools, Scripts. I've already got it pointed to the right directory. There it is. Press Run. And here it is. So you can see here's our UI thread, here's the VMS thread, and here's the current plan. So this is really a standalone / plugin. It doesn't really matter how you run it. All you have to do is change the exe to a DLL and it's ready to go. You can run it again, and the UI thread is going to change because it's spinning a new one up every time. And the VMS thread will stay fixed because that's provided by Eclipse. So this is a cool way to have your plugins kind of work both ways. I've shown another demo, similar but not quite as robust as this. This also gives you full multi-threading support when you're calling the API. So if you find this library useful, please let me know in the comments. Thanks.